Yeah. So I did a press release and, had those 3 drums at my store and let people, look at them. And I got to the point where I just felt that the Tom Mills needed to be in a museum. It needed to be someplace where people could go see it.
How long did it stay in that cabinet at the store?
Oh, I'm not sure how many years I kept it. I probably kept it for 4 or 5. See, I'm not sure anybody else does this. I just get in moods where I go, I've had that long enough.
And that's that.
I never wanted to hoard anything either. I turned around one day and had 5 wooden Dynasonics and said, "This is nuts.
Oh.
Other people need to have these. I don't need." So I kept 2, and I have 2. So I've gotten rid of. The 2 I have, probably one of those I had back then. So I probably got rid of 5.
Now look, all you new collectors, if you're watching this, and you're hearing him rattling off these drums, the DFS and the Stipple. We're not explaining to you what those are, but I got to tell you, every one of those are very rare collectible drums, okay? And right now he's talking about wood Dynasonics as opposed to metal Rogers Dynasonics. Totally different animals. The wood is much more expensive and more sought after. But he's talking about some very rare things, and we're just glossing over them quickly. But believe me, you guys, Harry has had some real rare pieces. Go ahead, Harry.
Well, and I've loved every one of them. But on the other hand, too, I don't get real emotionally attached. I mean, I like to look at them, and I like to mess around with them, and then, they really need to go to somebody else. Somebody else needs to go through that same procedure. I'm just pretty picky about making sure that it's not going to go to somebody who wants to turn it into a planter. Or
right.
The goal is I don't want to die owning any of these things. I want them to go to people, and then they hopefully send them to somebody else, and they hopefully send them to somebody else, and on it goes. So I kept 2 Dynasonics. I kept a silver one and a red one, and I had a fake one made because I wanted to do a story about how you have to be very careful and look at things now, because we also live in an age where parts are available and covering is available, and
very
people who know how to do things are available. So I didn't do it. I had a counterfeit made, but I had it made. I had a counterfeit Dynasonic made. I had it made out of solid oak.
Now, do you want to call it a counterfeit, or do you want to call it a reproduction? Or
I called it in the story I did for Modern Drummer the Magnificent Fake, because it was all the parts came off a metal Dynasonic. The covering was Mardi Gras off a bass drum. The guy sent me the covering because he was trashing the bass drum. So I had a 4.5 made because they didn't make Dynasonics in that size. So that, and then if it ever leaves my hands, I will tell people. But I have tried to always advertise this as my Magnificent Fake. It's not a real Dynasonic. It's part of it's a real Dynasonic and part of it isn't. But it's my tribute because I really love looking at Mardi Gras. And as far as I can tell, only 1 or 2 beaver tail Mardi Gras Dynasonics have been found. And
I was just at the show this year talking to Joe Luoma, and I believe he has showed me, if you go on the site here, you'll see Joe's interview. I believe he had a beautiful Mardi Gras set, and I think that was a wood Dynasonic in Mardi Gras. It was just mint.
Well, that's wonderful, because that's the time frame when, in 1964, when the beaver tails came out, that was also the time Mardi Gras ended. So the question is, we talked before about how do you decide what is rare?
Mm-hmm.
And I went and said, look, if you want the most rare Dynasonic, you find a Dynasonic in Mardi Gras, because that one is the one that just doesn't show up. So if I know 1 has or 2 have, perhaps this one's number 3. It's just that color was going out of favor as the beaver tail indestructible lugs were coming into favor.
And if it were a 6.5, would that even be more rare?
Sure. And then the question is, why are there so few wooden Dynasonics? Well, because the only guys that played them were either, big band guys a la Buddy Rich, who were putting Diplomat heads on the top and bottom, or they were symphony guys.
They used heads that thin?
Yeah, that's what they came out of the factory. They came out of the factory with diplomat heads, and so a rock guy gets a diplomat head on there, and it lasts about 1/10 of a second.
That cracks me up that that they came from the factory with diplomats. I would have thought they would have been ambassadors. That's amazing.
So here's how I know it. Ben Strauss, the sales manager of Rogers for years, retired to Phoenix,
and
I developed a correspondence with him. This was years ago. He's been gone a number of years. He was the most wonderful guy in the world. He and his wife lived in Phoenix in an apartment. And I wrote him, and I went out to Phoenix to see him. And I sat down with him, and Ben was an old horn player who loved drums and drumming. He was a good friend of Buddy Rich. He was a good friend of just about everybody. And, he was another guy that could tell you story after story after story. I wish I'd been related to Ben Strauss. I mean, he was my Uncle Ben in my mind. I mean, really? I loved that guy. I would sit and just listen to him talk and try to take notes and remember things. Jeez. And so we get talking about Dynasonics one day, and he's the one that told me about the diplomats, and that that's what Buddy wanted. He wanted a thin head. He wanted it real responsive.
And that's how you know that, not from any catalog, just right from Ben Strauss.
No. Yeah, right from Ben Strauss. And so I
said
to him, well, Mr. Strauss, when you've been retired from Rogers for a long time, what'd you take with you? Well, he took a couple of catalogs, and I said, well, that's great. I mean, is there anything you wish you would make? And he said, I wish I had a Dynasonic. And I said, well, what kind? What do you want? He goes, a white pearl, a 5x14 white pearl, like Buddy played. And I said, okay, well, let's get you one. And so, back in that time frame, they weren't too hard to find. And so I had one. I had a white marine pearl Dynasonic, and I just had the heads. No, I didn't have the heads changed. At that point, I sent it to him with the heads that I had on it, which were a new ambassador top and bottom. And I sent it to him, and he called me. He goes, "Why aren't there diplomats on it?" Sorry about that.
Speaking of, all right, now that we're on Dynasonics, why don't you explain to me the significance of, and this is in collecting terms, I guess one is more rare than the other, but the 5-line Dynasonic and the 7-line metal Dynasonics.
Well, if you go back to when Rogers got started in metal drums, what they did was, well, let me go back a little farther. We always imagine that the drum company is making all of its products.
Mm-hmm.
You just think that that's probably the case. For example, one of the best kept secrets for the longest time was that Ludwig made their Superphonic, their most popular snare drum.
Right.
Well, they never made the Superphonic. The Superphonic was always outsourced, and for a long time, there was a company in suburban Chicago that made all the shells. Well, while they were making the Superphonic shells, they were also making Slingerland's metal shells, and they were making Camco's metal shells. They're all coming from the same factory.
All from the same place.
Yeah, and it was called Dahlem. They'd been out of business for a while, Dahlen.
Okay.
So they would just, ship the shells to Ludwig where they'd be plated, and Ludwig would, assemble the parts. Actually, only Leedy was the only company that made all their own stuff. They made their mallet stuff. I mean, it was a huge factory in the 20s. It was 100,000 square. Well, no, it got up to just under 100,000 square feet by the time they sold the company, and then everything went up.
Didn't they make a bunch of additions to the company, to the Leedy company?
Yeah,
the building.
The first building started in 19. They got out of where they were in 1903. So the first building's between 03 and 04, and then the building that's still there started in 1910 as an add-on to the original factory, which they then tore down, and then they built it kind of L-shaped, and then it was kind of U-shaped, and anyway, it got up to just about 100,000 square feet. But they made everything. But just like today, the drum companies that exist today, they outsource.
Right.
They outsource stuff. And so what happened with Rogers was they weren't making their shells. They bought their original metal shells from Gretsch. So the original metal Dynasonics were Gretsch shells.
See, now I never knew that.
Well, and the argument or the historical perspective is what we need. Why was that? Well,
yeah.
For the longest time, everybody wanted wood shell snare drums. I mean, if you go in the big band period, they're all playing wood shell snare drums. And you go into the jazz period, they're all playing wood shell snare drums. When did the metal shell snare drums come? Well, they would have them for a while, and then they'd be gone. They had them, and then you get into World War II, and they didn't have any metal to use, and you come out of it, and they're still using wood, and then you start seeing metal come out a little bit. And so Ludwig introduces the Superphonic in 1959, not long after they got the name back, and it's a pretty much dead-on copy of the Silver Anniversary drum that was done about 1935.
Now, the Silver Anniversaries, did Adrian Kirschler also do a reissue of that? I'm not sure if he did or not.
No, he didn't do that, I don't think. He did the...
what was it?
He did a two-lug... the Silver Anniversary drums have the first edition Imperial lugs on them.
Okay, the tap
with cutouts because they did them for the metal drums.
Gotcha.
So anyway,
Ludwig
sort of reintroduces that in 1959, and it's in brass, and it's the drum made up till about 1962 that everybody wants because it's a Superphonic, the original Superphonic made of brass, and people are spending all kinds of big money for them. Because then Ludwig says, well, this is really dumb. We can buy aluminum for a lot less money than we can brass, so let's make them out of aluminum. Let's call it Lud alloy. And
Lud alloy, yes.
Yeah.
Now let's go a little earlier here.
Bill Ludwig said, my dad would go, well, what's the cheapest? What's the cheapest market price? And that's what we're going to make it out of.
Lud alloy. Jeez.
Mr. Ludwig, how long did you think a drum set would last? In the 30s and the 40s and the 50s when you were turning these out. He said, a year?
A year.
You're kidding? I said, you're kidding me. He goes, no, a lot of the metal was pot metal. They didn't finish the insides. And, they wanted the stuff to fall apart, so you had to buy another one the next year. And look at us now. We're sitting there going, great, this is 70 years old or 60 years old or 50 years old.
Now, what about the drums, some of the drums from the 20s that Ludwig was doing, like such as the Super Ludwig and the Super Sensitive? And I have a question following this that's pretty, I've been waiting to get this answered. But what do you think a Super Sensitive would go for? And what we mean by that is it had snares underneath, the top head and the bottom head, two sets of snares?
Yeah, the original Super Sensitive had two sets of snares because back in that time frame, as brushwork was very important, they would like the sound of wires under the top head. And, as the years have gone on, for anybody that finds a drum like that, they may find that the snares are missing and the snare mechanism's been dismantled because later players didn't like that idea, especially as you needed something to be louder, and guys would hit those drums and they'd rattle because of that top mechanism.
No.
So I think in a practical sense, the Super Ludwig is fine today. I mean, you can play a Super Ludwig today.
Yeah.
A Super Sensitive is really sort of outdated again because unless you were going to take that mechanism out, you're going to hear a rattle or you're just going to have to be a brush player. So in my world, it would make more sense for somebody to look for a Super Ludwig than to look for a Super Sensitive.
Now, someone asked me to ask you this question.
Super Ludwigs are metal and wood, and it just really depends on the finish. But I in my world, of course, we've had a little bit of a recession, obviously. In my world, I would say you always are going to be looking somewhere in the $1,000 to probably $3,000 range, upper number for the better examples of them. I have one that was a stipple that was restored because the stipple was so washed off.
Stipple Super Ludwig or Super Sensitive?
Super Ludwig was done in all brass, and then the shell I had black paint cooked on it. So it's sort of like the stipple, and anybody who sees it is directly. I mean, just goes to that drum over other stuff. That's why I went back and said on that do-all, that black and gold look is just like the Statue of Liberty is going to pull people in.
It's stunning.
Yeah, brand new. It just stops you cold.
Now, have you ever heard of, and I have not, but someone asked me this question, and I said I would ask you. That's why I wanted to ask you about the super sensitive, but ever been 3 strainers, 3 sets of snares on a drum? Someone was telling me yes, but I've never seen that.
I don't know of 3. I know of 2, but 2 different versions of it. Ludwig came out with a thing called the New Era about 1930.
New Era sensitive, right?
Well, and what happened was it had snare wires on the bottom head. It had snare wires on the bottom of the bottom head, the snare head, but it also on the inside on the top of the head.
Okay.
So what would happen is if you tore the top head, you could flip the drum over and still get a snare sound by playing the batter head with your brushes or sticks, and because there were snare wires now, as you flip it over, on both sides of the head, so they were under the head now too. But that lasted 1 year, and everybody, I think, who could have seen it. See, this is that other thing about rare. Why is it rare? Why is it rare? Is it rare because not very many examples have survived because it was very popular and we can luckily have a few left? Or is it rare because nobody wanted to buy it then, and that's why there are only a few examples now? And that's what I think happened with the New Era. It's just rare because nobody liked it.
Kind of like knob tension drums. I mean, they were a big failure, I guess, for Leedy, right?
Tom Jenkins of Leedy, late sales manager of Leedy, said they lost a fortune on knob tension drums. They spent so much money having them sent back to the factory to get repaired, and they just threw their hands up, and that was, it was a short lifespan.
What do you think a set of those should go for today? Just, I don't know if it's possible to price things in this economy today, but
a good snare drum or a drum set?
Whole set.
A whole set. So 22, 13, 16 in the snare drum?
Yeah.
Well, I think Mark Cooper has one for sale. It's got two 16s, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he sent pictures of it.
Knowing Mark, he probably wants a 2-bedroom house in Philadelphia. Maybe 3-bedroom.
Now, he's got some fantastic stuff. He really does. He just showed me a set of dreadnoughts, and I thought, amazing.
Yeah, I saw those too.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for Mark, Steve Maxwell, some other folks who really not only have good sources to help find things.
They come up with amazing stuff.
They find great examples, and I love hearing the stories about somebody goes, we found this in the attic. This was Grandpa's whatever, and we want to, sell it to somebody who appreciates it. Those stories are still out there. I heard of a Max Roach first edition 4x14 that had the tube lugs on it, the Gladstone tube lug, and somebody, literally found it at a garage sale for $2.
Amazing.
Took it out of
collectors, you hear that out there? I mean, these stories just make my mouth water. I can't believe it. And all these guys, Mark Cooper, they all have stories like that, and I'll bet you do too. And I'd like to hear about them. So why don't you write me and tell me about them sometime? Yeah.